Okay, so let's take a look at some other aspects of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. So another monumental building that was found is usually referred to as a granary, and you could kind of see why from the picture. A building would have been on top of this major platform, and the platform had these channels that ran underneath, most likely for air circulation. So if there was grain stored in the building, it would remain dry and it would not spoil. Right. So let's now turn our attention to craft specialization, which is connected to trade in Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus civilization. Craft specialization and the production of goods for trade was a really important part of Indus civilization. You can see some of the different kinds of crafts that existed in the cities, and we're going to look at a few of them and see how important craft specialization was. Here in Harappa, it looks like the marketplace was probably right near the city entrance. You can imagine that traders from other areas, like for example, there's supposed to be someone from Afghanistan with lapis lazuli trading with a Harappan merchant who has the standardized weights in order to measure out a certain amount of goods. There's also evidence of the crafts being produced in workshops. So there are many workshops that have been excavated in these Harappan cities where they found debris of production, where they found kilns, for example, to make different kinds of ceramic goods, where they have found the raw materials to make other kinds of goods. So we're going to look at some of these. They range in quality and they range in terms of the kinds of goods that what in terms of what they were used for. So from utilitarian goods, these are everyday common cores of stone which blades were taken off, and blades would have been used for sickles and for butchering meat and things like that, to things that were more kind of precious. These are beads that are made out of semi-precious stones that involved a lot of labor to make. We're going to look at the process, but they took raw stone like this and were able to transform them to these highly polished, very colorful beads. Another good that was very important were bangles, or these kinds of bracelets. People who had more wealth could have shell bangles. These were shells that were cut into sections that formed bracelets. If you had a little less wealth, if you were sort of more in the middle class, you could have these stoneware bangles. These were clay bangles that were fired in such a way to simulate stone, but they were actually artificial stone. They were ceramic. Each of these beads required a great amount of labor. You can imagine these kinds of long beads in order to drill a hole through the entire thing without making a mistake and coming out, let's say, one of the edges, was very, very difficult. By looking at the beads under the microscope, archaeologists have realized that most likely the way they did it, based on the evidence of the beads, is that they drilled from one end, drilled from the other end, and met in the middle and kind of poked out the sort of separation between the middle. Now, because people in this area of India and Pakistan make beads in a very similar way today by hand, we have a little bit of an idea of maybe how they did in ancient times. So this required heating up the raw material, kind of soften it up, chip it down, heat it up again, chip it down more, grind it and polish it by hand, drill it, and then heat it out one last time to bring out the color. So a very labor-intensive process. As we're going to see, these kinds of long carnelian beads are not only identical in appearance to ones that were found at the royal tombs of Ur. Most likely, many of the beads in the royal tombs of Ur in Mesopotamia came originally from the Indus. Okay, now to make these kinds of bangles was also a complicated process. They had to use a kiln and a special pot to control the temperature in order to produce highly fired bangles that, again, were simulations of stone bangles. Now, these bangles are found all over the Indus cities, and they're also found on the statues and representations of the people. So it looks like these were not just pieces of jewelry. These had some sort of symbolic meaning to them, and it was you could think of something like a pink rubber bracelet for cancer awareness, or a marriage ring having the same kind of symbolic attributes in our society. Most likely these bangles were symbolic, but we don't know exactly what the symbolism was. All right, now as opposed to Mesopotamia and Egypt, there was quite a lot of access to trade goods and wealth by much of the population. Right, so whereas wealth items were kind of restricted mainly to elites in Egypt and Mesopotamia, you have a lot more wealth in the hands of people in Harappa, and access to trade goods. So not just in the cities, but also in the smaller sites, people had access to these kinds of beads and gold work and these trade goods. And what this shows is that there was less social stratification in the Indus civilization than in Egypt and Mesopotamia. At the end of our discussion today, we're going to look and compare Egypt and Mesopotamia, and what we're going to see is that some of the things that we see in Mesopotamia and Egypt don't exist in the Indus, and some of the things that we think are sort of givens for a civilization are actually not givens. Civilizations work in different ways, as we'll see. This is Mark Knoyer. He's the American director of the Harappa project, and he's showing the use of a bronze drill to drill into one of these stone beads, give you an idea of the labor-intensive process involved. It was bronze material. You can see these kinds of blades, chisels, fishhooks, mirrors, bowls, things like that, a spear over here, and the pottery, which was very similar in style all over the region. And you can see it looks kind of like a tandoor cover, highly decorated pottery. Okay, so what's the evidence for... We have a lot of evidence of trade within the Indus, and we talked a little bit about trade outside of the Indus with other areas. What is more of the evidence for trade between the Indus and Mesopotamia and the Arabian Peninsula? There's a good amount of evidence. One piece of evidence, or one example, is a seal that's found in the Persian Gulf that has an elephant on it, an Indian elephant, not an African elephant. So this is showing a connection between people in the Arabian Gulf and the Indus civilization. These long beads that we just saw produced in the Indus Valley, these are examples of those same kinds of beads, but found in Mesopotamia. And again, beads from the royal tombs of Ur also were from the Indus. This is an interesting piece right here. This is a cylinder seal impression from a merchant living in Mesopotamia. Has the merchant's name and also has where he came from. And it says that this merchant came from a place called Meluha. Meluha is the ancient name for the Indus. So this is the personal seal of a merchant who traveled from the Indus Valley all the way to Mesopotamia, lived in Mesopotamia, traded, and dealt with the local bureaucracy by having his own seal produced. Here, this is a piece of clay, and it has a stamp on either side. And the stamps are actually stamps that are symbols of different regions. This eagle symbol that you can see a representation here from Central Asia, this is a symbol from Central Asia. The other side shows this Indian elephant, which you can see on Indus seals. Now, if you had something that was stamped with a stamp from two different regions, what could this thing be? Well, when we have stamps from two different regions, it's usually on a passport. So maybe this is some sort of passport or trading agreement or something like that. In terms of the burials, there are burials in houses that show, again, distribution of wealth and less social stratification in Harappa and Mohenjo-daro compared to Mesopotamia and the Indus. People were buried with pottery and other goods. Now let's look at the religion. We don't have a lot of evidence of exactly what the religion was based on because Harappan language has not been deciphered, but we do have depictions that we can interpret. So one of the things we have are female figurines. Again, these might represent fertility, but you can also see the stance of this woman. You can see the bangles on her arm. This hand is broken off, but originally her hands would have been touching each other in front of her face. This is a common greeting stance and prayer stance in India today. So we can see some connections between ancient India and modern India. Another example can be found here with this male horn deity. So horns probably representing a bull. We said bulls usually represent male fertility. So there's probably some symbolism here, right? So we see kind of a focus on fertility in the religion, but you can also see that he's seated with his hands resting on his knees and his feet meeting together right there. Now, you've probably seen this kind of pose before. This is the yoga position, or usually called the lotus position, comes from yoga, which you can see in Buddhist sculptures. You can see it in many depictions of art. Yoga originally comes from India, and it's connected to religious practice. Here's another depiction of that male horn deity in the lotus position. So the lotus position that we know from yoga probably originates from 2500 BC during the height of the Indus civilization, and it probably had important religious connotation back then. A lot of the scenes of religious worship usually take place in the outdoors, so we see usually, again, animals outdoors. We have ritual dancers who are, because we see vegetation, this is probably a scene that's taking place outdoors. Depictions of a ritual tree or again, someone outside. Usually animals on these seals, and the animals usually in front of some sort of offering bowl, right? This looks like an incense burner. This is a clay depiction of that male horned deity. And again, you can see some of the female figures, pretty elaborate, a lot of them with those bangles. Here's an elephant. Those seals, like we talked about before, usually have repeating animals, right? That is, there are some seals that have the unicorn. This is a zebu, a rhinoceros. Because these seals are used to control things, they're used for bureaucracy, they're used for approval of goods and contracts and things like that. We think that these animals, like we said before, represent different groups. Maybe they're groups of merchants, craftspeople, we're not exactly sure. Maybe some sort of class within the Indus civilization. All right, now let's look at the political and social organization. What I'd like you to do is make a list, just a brief list, of all the things that tell us that the Indus civilization was organized, that there was leadership present in the Indus civilization. Then I'd like you to make another list of all the things that seem to be lacking here in the Indus civilization when you compare it to Mesopotamian Egypt, right? That is, what are some highlights of Mesopotamian Egypt that we saw that we haven't talked about at all with the Indus civilization? So when you make a brief list, pause the video right now, and then come back and we'll talk about it. Okay, so hopefully you came up with something. We talked about evidence that there was organization. They had seals. They had a grid plan for the cities. They had a sewage system. All of that requires leadership. Leadership existed. They had standardized weights. Right? So we know there were leaders. Who were the leaders? Well, that's a little hard to tell. Who were the leaders? Because what is missing here? What don't we have? What exists in Egypt and Mesopotamia that we talked about? Let's take Egypt for an example. The same things existed in Mesopotamia when we look at things like large temples. Do we have large temples in the Indus? We don't. We have a ritual bath, but that's different than a temple where we can see, a clear monumental building, presence of hierarchy, a priesthood, things like that. What else don't we have in the Indus? We don't have evidence for these extremely powerful kings like we have in Egypt and Mesopotamia, right? In Egypt especially, enormous statues of pharaohs. Do they exist in Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa? No, we have nothing like this in Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. What else don't we have? What did we find? What's the most famous, one of the most famous things that was found in Egypt that Howard Carter excavated in 1922? King Tut's tomb. Do we have royal burials in the Indus? We don't. Yeah, they haven't been found. Do we have evidence of warfare in the Indus? No, there's only one depiction of fighting in the Indus. We don't have anything like what you have in Egypt, where many, many scenes of pharaohs smiting their enemies. We saw the same thing in Mesopotamia, right? Art, texts, fortification walls, weapons, clear evidence of war. In the Indus, you don't have that. Right? So this is a very different kind of society, and it's a little bit of a puzzle for archaeologists who are trying to figure out how the Harappan society worked. And Harappa is also a great case to show us that some of the things that we saw in Mesopotamia and Egypt are not inevitable. They're not the way civilizations work. Civilizations can work in different ways. And so, after studying Egypt and Mesopotamia, you might say to yourself, well, war's inevitable if you have large societies. Well, not necessarily. Or hierarchy and extreme differences in wealth is inevitable in a large society. Not necessarily, right? Because Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, the Indus civilization worked differently. This is a depiction of some sort of leader, but it's on the small side. And this is one of the few depictions of some sort of leader wearing some sort of gold, maybe crown and a textile. But that's about all you have. So what exactly is going on here? Right? Can you explain it? If you had to explain it, right? There's clear organization for leadership, right? And organization. So who are the leaders? If it's not these god kings like you have in Egypt, what's going on here? Can you think of any idea? These are some of the ideas that people have thrown out. One, instead of having one major leader, maybe you have groups that are organizing different aspects of Indus civilization. So sometimes I've had students who say maybe it's kind of like a democracy. We don't know. And maybe it's not quite a democracy. Maybe it's just sort of a collective leadership where instead of having one authoritarian ruler, you have groups of people that are in charge of different aspects. So certainly it's more equal, but it's not necessarily that those people were elected, but definitely more equal. There's less differences in wealth here. Maybe people are playing down wealth differences. Maybe there's kind of like an egalitarian culture. And we definitely saw that there is less social stratification. Right? So maybe the society is focused on trade, distribution of trade goods, not having a few people in charge of everything, and not fighting each other in terms of warfare, more trading with each other, that you produce essentially a very different society than you see in Mesopotamia and Egypt. So maybe this was a civilization that was based on an egalitarian belief, where maybe they really were egalitarian. Some people doubt that. There definitely were people in charge because there were big decisions being made and planning of cities and things like that. But it worked in a different way, right? You didn't have a very warlike state. You had a state where the economy was booming, where there was lots of trade and lots of, wealth in the hands of people within the society, and infrastructure built like those massive sewage systems. You had sewage in Mesopotamia, sewage systems, but nothing as complex as what you had in Harappa. So it looks like the leaders were, kind of taking care of the population of the city. Okay, what led to the rise of the state in the Indus? It wasn't warfare, obviously. Irrigation, not so much. population growth, that's part of it, right? But it's not just the population getting bigger, because you could have had just more of the same size villages appearing, right? Rather than having, let's say, 1,000 villages of 100 people, you could have had 5,000 villages of 100 people, but each village is still small. That's not what's going on. People were moving to sites that then became cities. Why were they moving to those sites? Probably the main push force in the development of the state and civilization in Harappa was trade. Right? If there's a trading post, a place where merchants live, a place where craft specialists live, it attracts people to move there because there are economic opportunities and opportunities to gain wealth items. And that leads to an increase in the population. It becomes even more of a hub of trade and attracts more people. Right? So it's almost like gravity. Once you have trade at these sites, it kind of pulls people in. And the bigger it gets, the more gravitational pull it has, and it pulls even more people in. So trade was probably the most important factor in the development of the Indus civilization. Now,